Hi everyone, welcome to this video. So in the last video we actually saw how to work with if-else statements in Python, where we were basically trying to have multiple conditions, and if some condition satisfies, then how a function basically executes or how a function behaves. We saw that, and just as an example we also looked how to basically enhance the features of a function, which basically what we want to have very powerful functions. And we defined a function where we used if-else statements. And if you remember, so we basically defined a function to find out whether a particular number is even or odd, right? And you probably remember this lines of codes where first we basically tried to see, okay, what is the remainder. And you remember that the percent sign is used to represent the remainder, the modulus. And basically whenever the remainder is 0, that means that whenever divided by 2 the remainder is 0, that means the number is even. And if it is not, that means the remainder would be 1 and that would be odd, right? And it was working, right? So just to showcase again, like we have a print statement and we are trying to see whether 5 is an even and odd, and obviously 5 is odd. So if we just run this function, it should come as odd, right? Today we would be actually moving from the conditions to loops, and this is another very important, very fundamental thing in Python, that not only in Python but in any programming language. And this is something that once you actually learn it properly, you would be very close to actually understanding how almost any function works, right? Obviously there are other stuffs, but this particular loop or iteration, so how to do iterations, is very important knowledge to have during programming. So what are for loops? Why loops are important? Loops. So the thing is that in programming, or whenever you are trying to execute something, there might be cases where you have to basically iterate through a lot of things. So you have to repeat whatever you're trying to do multiple times. And one way is to explicitly write the commands for it, right? Like, say for example, say I want to move from 1 to 2 3 4 5 6 7, and I want to go up to 100. If I want to move in like that, I can probably and probably want to print something. Let's say I want to print 1 2. So just to showcase, let's put some comments. So let's say I want to print something like 1 2 3 4 and so and so forth, like up to 100. So what is the way? One, so you already have seen like print statement can put numbers into the console, right? So we can print, we can basically put a variable. We define a variable like, okay, a equals to 1, and we can try to do, okay, let's print a, which is 1. Then again change a to 2, and then again write it. But there should be some better way, right? Because in this way it would be repetitive and it would be 100 times in this scenario. In some other scenario where you are trying to repeat a step, it could be like you could probably be repeating it for like thousands of times, and you don't want to write each and every step, right? So there should be one, I would say, better way to write iterative steps, and that's for that basically we have loops. So there are two kinds of loops basically. One is for loops and another is while loop. So for loop and while loops. So these two things actually work almost similarly. So it's almost like a if-else statement, right? So these are comments for or while, and it basically what it does is iterate through until a condition is met. Again, you need to put some condition to basically let the interpreter know up to when that particular loop needs to be run. So loop means that it would execute repetitively whatever it tries to execute, and only will exit that particular loop whenever that condition will not be met, or if you basically explicitly tell that, okay, I want to exit the loop, and we will see that as well. So let's basically get on to some examples to see how that this might become handy, and we will basically look both in for loops and while loops as well. Okay, to start with, let's take an example. So in the previous day's example, we were basically have defined a function which was which kind of help us to figure out, okay, what is if I input a number, whether it's odd or even. But now, say for example, I want to do it for multiple numbers. Say I have a list, or let's first try to see what it would be like doing it for multiple times. I have to write the print statement multiple times for all the numbers that I want to try out. Instead, let's say I have a list of numbers. Let's say 12, 13, 5, 19, just taking some random numbers, 654, 345, 1, 98, 908, like, okay, there are 7 8 numbers. Okay, now one way is to basically write it out, basically trying to put the function is even function for each and every numbers in this list, and try to see, like, okay, whether whether each element of the list is basically odd or even, right? Now we would basically use the for loop or while loop. We would do it one by one and see how we can actually can go through this list to understand how to basically repetitively do some action. So what is the repetitive step here? We basically want to call the function is even, because is even function would do us whatever we want to do, but it needs to be done for each member or each element of this list, right? Okay, so let's first start with for loop. So how for works? So you start with a simple for I in. So I here is basically a representative of the element, right? So I is not a variable, but I is basically representation. And now you have to basically write in, and then you have to basically follow it with a iterable. Iterable means something, some data type which can be iterated. So list, if you remember my video on data types in Python, so list is something which can be iterable, which means like the members can be iterated through. So list is an iterable, so you have to put a iterable after the in command, right? So for I, and you could use anything, because I, as I mentioned, I is basically an in representative, so you can name it anything. And then a here means the list I have put, again put some colons. And now you can first of all, let's try to see how for works. And for that, if you just write print, and then you have to put I, because if you remember, now I works as a representative. So what does this particular code block means is that it goes through a, every element of a, then so I becomes first of all the first element, say 12, then it prints 12. Then since if I do not put any other comments afterwards, it will again go back to the next element of a, so I becomes 13 then. So let's see first of all how this works. So let's save this particular code, and if I just run it now, so what we should see all the elements of a, right? And here it is. So what we have done, so just a basic how for loop works. So so here I can, instead of I can write basically anything. For I can say each, or I can say num. So you can't just put just remember that you can't put a command or whatever, or a keyword which is basically a command in Python. You can't put those, but you can basically, you are basically naming a variable here, right? Which would be kind of a representative of all the elements in that iterable. So you can write anything for the representation, but then you have to remember that whatever the name you have defined in this particular line, it needs to be followed right now. Because if I just write for num in a print I, now I doesn't have any meaning, it has to be num, because that's the representation we have chosen, right? So again, if I save it, we should actually get the same answer again. Yeah, okay, now it's clear how for usually works. Now what I have to do is if I, instead of just printing it, let's actually call our function is even. So let's call our function, and what we would do, we will actually input the numbers as the input parameter of the function, and we would input the results only. So once I save this, now if I again go back, let's actually clear up the screen. So if you remember, CLS is a in Windows, if you put CLS, it clear out the terminal. In Linux, it's just clear. The command is basically clear, CLEAR. Anyway, so now if I run this particular script, what should I get? Now I am not printing the numbers, but I am printing the result when is even function, which basically checks out whether a number is even or odd. It basically should be printing out the result of that function. So now if I say okay, now I got a list of even and odds. Why? Because 12 is even, 13 is odd, again 5 is odd, 19 is odd, 654 even, then 345 odd, 1 odd, 908 even. So here it is. So this is how basically for loop works. So if you want to basically repeat a certain executive thing, a certain function, whatever you, if you want to basically repeat a step, then you shouldn't want, and you probably do not want to basically explicitly mention that, because say for example now it's just 8 members in this particular list, but think about like actually trying to finding out all say all the odds or evens in the first 1,000 or say 10,000 numbers. This becomes very large then, right? Repetitive steps would be very large if the iterable is very large. So you don't want to basically write explicitly all of the members, or write or probably do some function on all the members. So a better way to do it is through for loops or while loops. Okay, so this was a good example of how for loops work. Now there's also something that you can do to exit. So for loop, once it starts, it basically loops over all the members of A. But say for example you want to stop at certain point, you do not want to go the extreme, right? So because if you, as you have seen, usually once you put it in a for loop, it goes through all the elements. Now what would you do if you want to basically stop at certain point? What you can do is you can use a command called break, 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 and we would just do that and showcase you how it works. So now the first line basically repeats the first line. Let's keep it the same, for num in A, print is even num. But now let's put an if condition. What I want to write, I want to write if num, because again remember that num is the representative, if num equals to say 19. Okay, so because I know that in my list there's a number called 19, it's the fourth number. So what I'm trying to do is if num is 19, break. Okay, that's what I wanna do. Just now let us again look at the code. Now we have the same for loop as we have written initially, but now we have also put another condition where we say okay, you are trying to move through the all the members of A, but now if you basically reach at certain point and if the number becomes 19, break out of the loop. Let's see whether it works or not. So save the file, and now if I run the file, you would see that I only got even, odd, just four results, right? Why I did just 4 results? Because obviously when it reached 19, 12, 13, 5, 19, when it reached 19, I have put another put a break on it. That means like I have told the interpreter that whenever 19 comes, break out of the loop. So that's why it came out of the loop. Just a reminder, because this also just want to put a note here, which is again a reminder that this indentation is very important. Always try to understand indentation, because even during debugging you would understand that under indentation means under a certain code block. So whatever is written under for, so everything should be inside the indentation, and if there is another condition or another something which needs an indentation, it should be done. So why we I'm actually just focused on it, because this is a major cause of doing mistakes, right? People a lot of times say, for example, if I just do say if I put if here, what it would do, it will basically tell the interpreter that this if statement, whatever I've written as if, it is not under for, right? So not under the code block of for. So which would basically mean it would be false, right? Because this whole loop then will be first of all executed, then only it would go, and since the break doesn't mean anything now, then it would give you a error, right? So this is why I stressed on it, because I have seen lot of people doing mistakes like this, where they do not follow the indentation, and it becomes a major mistake. So if comes one side under the for loop, and obviously break needs to be under the if, right? So you understand this how the whole thing works. Now let's actually try to see the same thing for while loop. Let's actually have something new. Let's say now I want to print multiple numbers. Let's say I want to print up to 10, 1 to 10. One way, obviously the explicit way would be to just write, okay, print 1, print 2, print 3, print 4, and so on and so forth, which we understood that it's a bad way of doing programming. Then obviously through for loop we can do something like, okay, for I in range, okay, there's something called range, which again is an iterator. If you remember, we talked about it in the data types video. So if I write range 11, so range is basically a function, right? So at the end of the day, range is a function, so you can check it out what the range does. It usually basically gives you all the numbers from 0 to that particular number. So if I write something like this, okay, let's clear out yeah. So once I save it, and if I just run this function, it would come at 0 to 10, because range is a function which again is representative of a lot of numbers. So this is how you do it in for loop. Let's do it in a little bit different way through while loop. And here I would actually show you to put a counter, which is again a strategy for a lot of codes that you do every day. So what is a counter? It's nothing but just a variable that you put, and basically that you increment one by one to basically see, okay, how far we are going or something like that, right? So let's say let's basically define the counter as 0. So let's define it as I equals to 0. So this is basically our counter, or it could be I equals to 1, anything, like you can start from 0 or you could start from 1. Now you could say while, and how while works. So for while you have to put a condition. So in for we saw for works like, okay, for some variable in an iterable, right? So this is how the for command works. And for while, what you do is you write while, and after that you basically need to put a condition. So what is the condition I want to put? Let's say I put a condition on I, while I is less than 11. Okay, while I is less than 11, put a colon. What I want to do, let's just print I. But now I have to do something else. If while I less than 11 print I, what it do, it won't actually, let's see what it do first of all, right? Just clear out the screen. Now if I just do this, now what happened? As I see, it basically is going on and on and on, right? This code is going on. Why is that so? Because now there's a problem, right? And okay, first of all, let me tell you, if you ever encounter such a scenario where a code is running and it's not stopping, so one way to stop is control C. As you have seen, I just actually typed control C in keyboard and it tells me, okay, keyboard interrupt. Why you have to do this? Sometimes you can actually go into a infinite loop, so you have put such a condition which would be made all the time, and thus you are basically ensuring that your loop is not finishing. Remember, in the previous for loop, we were actually trying to bound the loop, right? That okay, I want to be in the range of say 11, which means like okay, stop when it is 10, right? Or even in the previous scenario, we were basically bounded by the list, because the list had some finite numbers. It actually had just 8 members, so we were only repeating just 8 times. But if you actually did some mistake and if you basically forget to put a bound on the iterable, or if you have written the logic in such a way that there is no bound to the actual logic of the loop, then it would basically go on indefinitely, right? So this is what happened actually in this scenario, and that is why I basically said that it is a wrong thing to basically write it out this way. So what was our intention? Our intention was to basically again print from 1 to 10 to show how while works. But what we did, we had initially I equals to 1, we defined I as 1. Now when while works, so while I less than 11, so I is obviously 1 right now, right? And I is 1 is obviously less than 11, so it printed I. But then we haven't put any other thing. So obviously I remained 1, and that's why it printed 1 multiple times, and like it will go on and on and on. It will just print 1 1 1 1 1, and as you have seen, so it was just printing out once. Why? Because we haven't put anything to actually do any work on I. So 1 is always less than 11, and that's why the condition is always satisfied, and that's why the loop becomes indefinite or infinite. But now let's do something so that it doesn't become an indefinite or infinite loop, but let's it be bounded. How we would bind it? So we basically increment I every step. Let's say we do I equals to I plus 1. Okay, what does this mean? This means, as you know, that equals to in Python basically is an assignment, right? So double equals to usually means like you are trying to check something, like whether they are equal or not. But if you are just put single equals to, it usually means assignment. So here we are assigning I equals to I plus 1. This is something that you can do in the programming, where you tell them, okay, while I less than 11, obviously 1 is less than 11, print it. But then in the next step, I plus 1, I should be I plus 1, which means the new I would be the previous I plus 1, which means 2 probably in the first case. Then when the second iteration would come, again it would be printed as 2. Then the previous I becomes 2 and the new I becomes 2 plus 1 3, right? So this is how you incrementally increase I, and then obviously after some time I would be becoming 11. Then 11 is not less than 11, 11 is equals to 11, and since this particular condition will not be satisfied, now the interpreter can come out of this particular loop. So let's save it and see now. In the previous scenario it actually was like going on and on, so let's put another clear statement, and if I now click it, what it again it should be shown, it should be come as 1 to 10, right? And here it is. So when I actually execute this file, you see 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. That's where it stops. Why? Because obviously after 10 it becomes 11, but 11 it can't actually go to 11, because then this particular condition I less than 11, this becomes false and it comes out. Similar to for loop, you can also use break to come out of the loop. So let's say you were writing I equals to I plus 1, but then you put another condition. If say I equals to 7, then you want to break. So break. So if you write that, what would happen? Let's again run this file, and now you can see 1 2 3 4 5 6. So I can also break out of a loop using the break command in both for loops and also in the while loops. Okay, so this is all for today. Just one another short thing which you can or cannot do. It's not a mandatory or a necessary thing. That is, you can actually write this particular line, the fifth line where I have written I equals to I plus 1. You can actually write it in some other way in a shorthand notation. And why I am saying this, because if you actually go through some other codes, you might see something, and you might become might become a little bit confused about seeing that particular thing. So this is nothing but I plus equals to 1. Okay, what does this mean? So basically this is the same thing as I equals to I plus 1. This is the same thing which can be written as I plus equals to 1. First of all, let's actually try to see. I am always confused about whether plus comes initial or the second. Let's delete a couple of things. Plus equals to 1. Okay, as you know, so anything after hash basically becomes a comment, so it doesn't it shouldn't be bothered with this thing. Okay, now save it. Okay, I have saved it. Now let's took the file. Okay, yeah, it's working same. So as you have seen, so I plus equals to 1 basically works same as I equals to I plus 1. So this is a shorthand notation, and you would see it in a lot of places, and that's why I just wanted to mention it. It's no big deal. So similar way, say for example, if you wanted to do incremental decrease, right? So in this case we basically increased I 1 by 1 by 1, right? So we basically added 1. So it basically replaced I equals to I plus 1. So instead it might be like I equals to I minus 1. So let's say I is 11, and you are trying to see while I less than 0. Just changing a couple of things, or less than 1. So, or say let's not do it less than, but why greater than 1. So 11 is obviously greater than 1, so this condition is satisfied. It should come as that, but now I can write it as minus. So again, minus equals to basically means that let's write the actual thing in the right hand side. It basically means I equals to I minus 1. So this is the shorthand notation. Again, I minus equals to 1 means I equals to I minus 1. So here we are basically decreasing the I. So we started with a higher I, which is like 11. We defined it as 11. Now if the condition is satisfied, we print that number, and then we decrease it by just 1. So, and let's keep this break statement, which means it should come as like 11 10 9 8 and 7. After 7 it should break. Let's save this and see whether it's working or not. Yeah, it's working, right? So you see up to 8, right? And if you can probably ask why up to 8, and that is also very obvious, because let's say in the first iteration it would be 11, it's greater than 1 printed out, but now the I here in this fifth line of code, 11 becomes 10, right? The new I becomes less than 1, and it checks this particular condition whether it's equals to 7 or not. Obviously 10 is not 7, so it again goes back. It's again printed, so 10 is printed. Similarly 9 is printed, 8 is printed, but now after 8 is printed, now the new I becomes 7. And since you are putting the break after that, so here after the updation, so here the I basically changed, right, in this step. After you change the I to 7, now we saw that okay, whether I is 7 or not, and obviously it broke, right? So this is why the print statement didn't work. Obviously if you do the updation before and then print it, then it would come up to 7. So let's also show you that. So this is a good example of how this in Python interpreter works. So it basically works sequentially. So instead of printing it before updation, if we do it after, let's say, and save it. Let's delete the extra lines over here. So now we are basically updating first, then we are printing. Now there would be one thing, since we are actually doing it. So now I would start from 10, right? Because first I was 11, but we are not printing 11. We are directly updating it. The new I becomes 10, and then we are printing it. So now it becomes from 10 to 7. Let's save it, and let's try to run the function. Yeah, 10 to 7. Okay, so we actually did a couple of cool things. First of all, we repeated the last class, we recapped the last class function, where we basically tried to find out how to use if else statement in a function. Then what we did is understood why loops are important, and then we learned two things, two comments: for loops and while loops. We understood how for loops work, we understood how while loops work. We also saw how to break out of the loop using break command, and we basically saw how that can basically give us the flexibility to use it in different scenarios, right? So hope you guys learned something new. If you have any doubt, if you have any comments regarding these lessons, feel free to reach out through comments or through other channels, and keep learning, guys. See you in the next video. Thanks. Bye bye.